Hey guys, and welcome back, or if you're new here, hi, welcome, I'm Georgia. On my platforms, I cover unsolved true crime, trying to spread the word about unsolved cases that really need eyes on them, as well as sort of bringing awareness to important moments in history. And today's video kind of meets at the intersection of those two categories. Today's episode is about a huge historical event that I've wanted to cover for a really long time. You guys have been requesting this for a really long time, but this is a huge case to talk about. It's a really heavy case and one that I kind of needed nudging in the right direction to cover. At the time that Oklahoma City bombing happened on April 19th, 1995 at Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in Oklahoma City, it was the deadliest act of homegrown terrorism in US history, resulting in the deaths of 168 people. Although the perpetrators were caught alive fairly quickly, their true motivations behind the attack have always remained fairly hazy. To this day, we don't know exactly why this bombing happened, why so many people lost their lives in such a horrific manner. But it is a clear warning of what extremism, when left unchecked, can lead to. The perpetrators here, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, were both former US Army soldiers who were associated with the extreme right wing and militant patriot movement. Both men were radicalised by white supremacists and anti-government propaganda, convinced that the US government was trying to restrict the rights of private citizens, and in particular their rights under the Second Amendment, their right to bear arms. This does feel like a very relevant time politically to be sharing this story in particular, as a warning of what this kind of radicalisation, this kind of extremism can do in the most extreme of circumstances. And another reason I wanted to finally cover this case today is that I was inspired to finally talk about this topic after listening to The Debutante on Audible, so a huge thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video. The Debutante is a podcast about a woman called Carol Howe. She was a charismatic, wealthy debutante from Tulsa, turned white supremacist spokeswoman, turned undercover informant, who eventually managed to help bring down the Oklahoma City bomber Timothy McVeigh. Carol's story sounds like urban legend, but she was real, and award-winning journalist John Ronson has searched her out, taking a closer look at her world and her version of the story, her journey to extreme radicalization and back again. This podcast is truly wonderful. It kept me hooked beginning to end, even with the really heavy sort of topics spoken about in it, and it started me on a journey to want to learn as much about this topic as possible. It's a podcast that I know you guys are going to find absolutely fascinating. I just cannot recommend it enough. By clicking on the link in my bio, you can go and try Audible for free for 30 days, and members get to pick a new book every month, picking from all the latest new releases and bestsellers. And the best part is you get to keep the book for good. That is yours forever, even after you finish listening. Once you guys have finished listening to The Debutante, make sure you come back here and let me know in the comments what you guys think about it, because I need to talk to somebody about this podcast. It is mind-blowing. At 9:02 a.m. on the morning of 19th of April 1995, people had just sat down at their desks inside the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building in downtown Oklahoma City, ready to start their work for the day. This was a United States federal government building where multiple agencies had their offices, the ATF, the DEA, the Secret Services, to name just a few. About 550 employees worked in the building, and it was also a great place for working parents because there was a daycare within the building called America's Kids. Parents could drop their kids off before they started work for the day and then pick them up at the end of the day. It was great. And of course, with this being in a very busy area of downtown Oklahoma City, it wasn't only people inside the Murrah building who were in the firing line when Tim McVeigh decided to park a truck bomb by the north side of the building. At 9:02 a.m. when the bomb went off, people walking past stood no chance of survival. The blast was so intense that half the Murrah building caved in. 324 other buildings nearby were also destroyed or damaged in the blast. The blast was so strong that people nearby thought it was an earthquake, or some thought the apocalypse was happening, or that war had started in Oklahoma City. The truth was much more insidious. But to be honest, this bomb was planned to be the start of a war. Tim McVeigh, radicalised by extremist right-wing and anti-government views, thought they would incite a war against the government, being the first movement of many. And instead, the opposite happened. Of course, American society rallied together, disgusted that anyone could inflict so much harm on so many innocent people. But who was Timothy McVeigh? When you picture the kind of person to do something like this, the kind of upbringing, childhood they must have had, you probably wouldn't think of Tim McVeigh, who for the most part had this all-American upbringing. No outright childhood trauma or abuse, not the kind of stuff that you'd usually find in the backgrounds of serial killers and hardened criminals. McVeigh was born on April 23rd, 1968 in Lockport, New York, and whilst, as I said, his childhood was free from outright trauma, it definitely wasn't perfect. His parents divorced when he was 10 years old and he went to live with his father, Bill McVeigh. Being scrawny and not particularly athletic, he became a target for childhood bullies, which would lead to a lifelong hatred for bullies. How he came to do what he did, killing so many people from this original hatred of bullying, just goes to show the sort of trajectory his radicalisation would take over the coming years. He came to view the government as the ultimate bullies with too much control over their citizens. It seems that his first steps into radicalisation may have taken place when he was just a young teenager, when he first discovered the Turner Diaries, a racist 1978 novel by William Luther Pierce, under the pseudonym Andrew MacDonald. The Turner Diaries depicted a violent revolution in the USA, which eventually leads to an insurrection and the federal government being overthrown, and ultimately it leads to a race war. The novel is explicitly racist and anti-Semitic, and the FBI have labelled it as the Bible of the racist right. In the novel, the organisation begin their campaign by bombing the FBI headquarters, which creepily mirrors McVeigh's real-life bombing in Oklahoma City. It was also as a teenager that his lifelong fascination with guns would begin, likely after admiring his grandfather's rifle. He would spend hours developing his marksman skills, spending hours just shooting soft drink cans as a teenager. And by the age of 14, he also became interested in survivalism, convinced that one day a possible nuclear attack or overthrow of the government will mean that he is forced to survive off the land, and there he begins stockpiling. At school, McVeigh was considered to be an above-average kid. He was bright and all-round good student, despite his very unusual interests outside of school. He was generally thought of to be nice and polite, and families in the neighbourhood would choose him to babysit their kids. People thought he was a little bit weird, but isn't everyone a little bit weird? He graduated high school and attended a computer school for a couple of years, but in May 1988 he enlisted in the US Army, which is where he would really come into himself. In basic training at Fort Benning in Georgia, McVeigh formed a close friendship with his platoon leader Terry Nichols, with the two bonding over their joint distrust of the government and their extreme right politics. This was likely the first time in his entire life that McVeigh was able to talk openly about his views. It's also worth mentioning at this point that the pair were also white supremacists. They were incredibly racist and anti-Semitic. McVeigh excelled in the military. That super structured lifestyle seemed to suit him really, really well, and he was quickly promoted to sergeant. He goes on to serve in Fort Riley, Kansas, which is where he'd meet Michael Fortier, another man who shared some of his more extreme views. McVeigh would eventually go on to serve during Operation Desert Storm in the Gulf War, and he would actually be awarded a Bronze Star for valour. He really was that all-American military superstar, the veteran who risked his life for his country, something which would go on to baffle people when he did what he did. People just couldn't put the two together. During his service, it's thought that he killed at least 2 enemy combatants, something which he would actually brag about to friends later in life. And that is not the done thing. Even in the military, you don't brag about killing people. It's still thought of something to be kind of shameful in a way. This is perhaps one of the earlier signs that something was going on in McVeigh's head. He bragged about killing people. In 1991, McVeigh attempted to join the Special Forces, but he was rejected, and instead he receives an honourable discharge from the army on the 31st December 1991. From there, it seems he just loses his entire focus. The military was everything. Without it, he didn't really know what to do. He didn't have that structure. So McVeigh spends the next couple of years just drifting around the country, following gun shows from state to state. Officially, he lived with his father again in upstate New York and worked as a low-level security guard, but by January 1993, he quit his job and just went on the road full-time, living as this kind of transient, just like I said, following these gun shows across the country. He met people who matched and maybe even exceeded his political views. Through 1992-93, it seems he falls further into this extreme right politics. Following the collapse of the Soviet Union, the American military was downsizing, and at this time, McVeigh's and many others' suspicions moved focus from these foreign communist leaders to a suspicion of the US federal government, particularly following the election of Bill Clinton, whose whole presidency campaign was focused on gun control and gun safety. McVeigh believed that people had the right to whatever firearms they wanted, like explosives, assault rifles, anything. He thought if you wanted it, you should be able to own it. Because of course, as recent history proves, that doesn't lead to anything bad at all, ever. No, who needs gun safety? We don't need it. Who needs it? That's sarcasm, by the way, just full clarity. At this time, McVeigh lived in Arizona with Michael Fortier, his army buddy, where the friends just experimented with marijuana and methamphetamines. McVeigh built a bunker and prepared for nuclear war. It's hard to really pinpoint what exactly it was or at which point McVeigh's radicalization really solidified. What was that final thing that threw him over the edge, no return? But most people point the finger to two things: Ruby Ridge and the Waco siege. Ruby Ridge, which I find really difficult to say, was the location of an 11-day siege that took place in August 1992 in Boundary County, Idaho. A man called Randy Weaver had a fugitive warrant out for his arrest after failure to appear on firearms charges. It was suspected that he was selling illegal firearms out of basically his home. Deputy US Marshals and FBI agents ultimately became involved in this 11-day standoff with Weaver and members of his family and a family friend. It was this huge mess in which Randy's wife Vicky and his son Sammy were killed, as well as a US agent. For McVeigh, this was a sure sign that the government were coming after his guns. These people had died because the government thought they were illegally selling guns. And then on the 28th of February 1993, there was a very similar situation in Waco, Texas. This essentially became a 51-day standoff between the authorities and members of the Branch Davidians, which are an offshoot of the Seventh-day Adventist Church that eventually turned into a cult. They lived on farmland 10 miles east of Waco and lived a simple life. The leader of the Branch Davidians at this time was a man called David Koresh, who claimed that he was the Messiah as prophesied in the Bible. He took on a number of spiritual wives, rumour has it some were as young as 11 years old. It was these allegations of child abuse and Koresh launching a retail gun business that really got the authorities' attention, who believed that he was illegally stockpiling weapons. The ATF obtained an arrest warrant for Koresh and a search warrant for the compound, which they executed on February 28, 1993, with more than 70 ATF agents storming the compound. Gunfire erupted, and nobody is entirely sure who fired first, but 4 federal agents and 6 Davidians ended up dying. After this, 900 law enforcement officials descended down on the compound, including multiple FBI hostage negotiators. Over 100 Davidians remained inside the compound, who Koresh did not allow to leave. The standoff lasted 51 days until eventually the US Attorney General Janet Reno gave permission for the FBI to raid the compound. At 6 a.m. on April 19, 1994, the FBI began spraying tear gas into the compound, trying to draw people out of their hiding places. Then the Davidians began shooting, and eventually a fire was started, and then it was too late. Investigators later found 76 bodies, 25 of whom were children. Koresh was one of them. The government's handling of this siege, which was of course played out in the media step by step, was heavily criticised by a lot of people, and not just by the radicalised. But for McVeigh, this was a very clear sign that the government were attacking the people and actively trying to remove their guns. During the siege, McVeigh actually travelled down to Waco and parked up just a few minutes from the compound, selling bumper stickers that read, "Fear the government that fears your gun," in support of the Branch Davidians. On the 19th of April, when it all came to a head, McVeigh was at the home of his old platoon leader, Terry Nichols, watching the siege live on TV. It was in that moment that he decided things had gone too far. He was going to fight back. So he started plotting his own war, brainstorming things that would get national attention. He considered assassinating US Attorney General Janet Reno or the FBI sniper Lon Haruchi, who participated in both sieges. He considered just blowing up an empty federal building, deciding that targeting a government building was dramatic and symbolic. But he ultimately decided that the message would be more powerful if people were killed. The people that he would go to kill were just pawns in the game to him, pawns to send the message that he wanted to send. They didn't matter as individuals. He believed that his bombing would be the opening shot in a great war against the government, the American people finally rising up. But I think he quite overestimated just how many people shared the same political views as him. So having decided on bombing a federal building, now the question was which one? McVeigh filled in his extremist friends Nichols and Fortier on his plans, and with them on board, him and Fortier went out to scout out the perfect location. In December 1994, McVeigh and Fortier headed to Oklahoma City to check out the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, and they decided this would be the perfect target. He decided against a number of other buildings because he wanted to target government workers as much as possible. For example, he ruled out the Simmons Tower in Little Rock, Arkansas, because there was a florist on the ground floor. They weren't government, he didn't really want to hurt them. I wonder if McVeigh knew about or really put much thought into the daycare inside the Murrah building, the children, the innocent children who would be killed. He would also say that he chose the Murrah building because it had this glass front that he expected to shatter in the blast, and because it had this large open car park across the street, that might absorb some of the blast and protect the nearby non-federal buildings. Spoiler alert, it didn't protect anything. So in December 1994, he'd finally picked his target, the Murrah building, but McVeigh and Nichols had actually been stockpiling the ammonium nitrate fertilizer he planned to use in his explosive since September. Ammonium nitrate was cheap and readily available, it made sense to use that in the bomb. They'd also been gathering all the other items they needed, items which I'm not going to say here because why would I? Early on in the planning process, he settled on April 19th as the day of the bombing, April 19th, 1995, the second anniversary of the Waco siege, and also it was Patriots' Day. It was a day that had great significance to him and his cause. Which brings us to April 19th, 1995, by which point McVeigh was actually now acting alone, or at least as far as we know, he was acting alone. Although Fortier had helped him scout out the buildings, when it came to actually assisting with the project, he refused. McVeigh told both Fortier and his wife about what he was going to do, showed them a diagram of the bomb he intended to build, and clearly they didn't propose enough to actually report anything, they just decided not to take part in whatever he had planned. If they had maybe told somebody what McVeigh was planning, multiple lives could have been saved. This needn't have ever happened. Terry Nichols, however, was due to take part for the vast majority of the planning process. He was just as culpable in the organisation of the bombing. When the pair met up at Geary Lake State Park on April 18th to assemble the bomb in a rental truck McVeigh had rented, Nichols shares that he's got cold feet. They're going too far, he didn't want to see it through. McVeigh threatened him, said that he had to go through with it, but he refused. But that didn't deter McVeigh. The hard work had been done, he could quite easily do the rest alone. On the morning of April 19th, McVeigh drives the Ryder rental truck into the city alone. A CCTV camera captures the truck first pulling over just a few blocks from the Murrah building at 8:57 a.m, where it's thought that McVeigh lights the first fuse. He then continues on the route, driving to the north side of the Murrah building where he lights the second fuse, and at 9:01 a.m. quickly exits the car, moving as far away from the scene as he can. A few days beforehand, McVeigh had actually bought a used Mercury Marquis from a used car dealership in Junction City, which on April 16th, so 3 days beforehand, he'd parked several blocks away from the Murrah building, or at least I think Nichols parked it a few blocks away from the Murrah building, and they removed the license plate. They left a note on the car reading, "Not abandoned, please do not tow, will move by April 23rd, needs battery and cable." McVeigh walked towards this getaway car as fast as he could, but only managed to make it 2 blocks away by the time the truck bomb went off at 9:02 a.m. The bomb went off just as people were sitting down at their desks for the day, the impact killing 168 people, including 19 children, and several hundred more were injured. Some were so seriously injured that their lives were changed forever in that moment. Within seconds of the blast, the surrounding areas resembled somewhat of a war zone, a third of the building reduced to nothing but rubble. The damage was actually so extensive that people assumed there had been 2 bombs, and seismic evidence and witness testimony actually supported this. It turns out that the second blast may have come from where the ATF was storing explosives in a secure area in the building. Yes, in a building with a daycare. No, I don't think this was legal, but correct me if I'm wrong. This was the worst act of homegrown terrorism in the nation's history at the time, and almost immediately the FBI arrived on the scene to begin the investigation, whilst first responders focused on saving as many people as they could, people trapped underneath the steel and concrete. Within the first hour, 50 people were rescued from the building, with every hospital in the area being briefed to expect high emissions. Temporary silences had to take place on the site so listening devices could be used to locate people's heartbeats, locate surviving people. In some cases, limbs had to be amputated in order to remove people from the rubble alive, trapped again under steel and concrete, tons of it. In total, 12,000 people helped in the relief and rescue operations. It's exactly what they say, isn't it? When something terrible has happened, look for the people who are helping. There's always more people who are helping than the terrible person who's done this awful thing. One nurse was actually killed in the rescue attempt when she was hit by falling debris, and 26 other rescuers had to be hospitalised. Eventually, the rescue operation sadly turned into a recovery mission. The search for bodies lasted 2 whole weeks. On May 5th, 1995, the rescue effort had to be concluded, by which point 3 victims were still known to be buried in the rubble. They just couldn't get to them yet. The youngest victim was 4 months old, the oldest was 73. 19 children died, 168 people in total. Going back in the timeline to the day of the blast though, and the immediate investigation, the FBI knew that they had to act quickly here. The perpetrator would have had an escape place, and they would have been getting further and further away with every second. If they wanted to find him, they had to act now. And the FBI had no idea who they were looking for. Coming on the back of a bombing at the World Trade Center in New York just a couple of years beforehand, which was the handiwork of Middle Eastern terrorists, the media and many Americans believed that this would also be the work of foreign terrorists. You can only imagine the harmful assumptions that were perpetuated over the airwaves in the hours that followed this blast. The only thing that made sense to people was that this was a foreign attack. No one suspected that it was going to be a homegrown American. The FBI were working under 3 possibilities: international terrorists, a drug cartel striking back at the DEA who were in the building, or an anti-government radical trying to start a rebellion against the federal government. Well, it seems they hit gold with that third guess. In a pure stroke of luck, when the truck exploded, the rear axle was blasted into the air and it landed just a block over, about 200 yards away, hitting a parked car. The axle housing contained the truck's confidential vehicle identification number, and from there, investigators quite quickly realised that this was a rider rental truck, rented from a rental agency in Junction City, Kansas. So agents headed to the rental agency to talk to the owner, who had assisted a man just a few days earlier in renting the truck in question, and together they formed a sketch. In the records, the name of the man who'd rented this van was a Robert D. Kling. However, the owner also insisted that there was a second man with Kling that day, of whom they also created a composite sketch. This man would come to be known as John Doe 2. So now the FBI had a name, Robert D. Kling, but they didn't know if it was a real name or an alias. Armed with these sketches, agents started canvassing the area around Junction City, asking people if they recognised the man in question. When they reached the Dreamland Motel, the receptionist said yes, she did. That looked exactly like the man who'd stayed in room 25, under the name Tim McVeigh. Was that his real name? I mean, this just seems too easy, doesn't it? In March, McVeigh had gone to the effort of taking out a fake ID with the name Robert D. Kling, a name inspired by somebody he met in the army. He rented the truck under the fake name, but then he signed into the motel under his real name. It was almost as if he was leaving breadcrumbs, as if he wanted the authorities to find him. And that kind of makes sense. If he's caught and has a trial, that would make for a huge platform for his anti-government message. Did he want to be caught this entire time? Was that his main goal here? Although, in saying that, the motel receptionist did say that McVeigh had originally used false names for the original transactions, but when he went to sign his name, he automatically signed Tim McVeigh, maybe by accident, maybe on purpose. The receptionist said that they were talking at the time, so he may well have been distracted and then it was too late. We don't know. And indeed, it wouldn't take long for the FBI agents to find McVeigh, because at this point, just a couple of days after the bombing, he was already being held in jail for a completely different crime. McVeigh had actually been arrested just 90 minutes after the bomb had gone off. After escaping Oklahoma City in his Mercury Marquis, McVeigh headed out of the city going north on Interstate 35. Just 75 miles north of the city, he's stopped by a state trooper called Charlie Hanger for not having a license plate on the car. Hanger would later say on First Impressions when he pulled this car over, he thought McVeigh was a very clean-cut kind of man with a military-type appearance. Makes sense. He was also wearing a windbreaker, and when McVeigh moved, Hanger noticed a bulge under his left arm, a concealed firearm not allowed in the state. Hanger grabs the bulge and tells McVeigh to turn around and put his hands behind his head. McVeigh warned him that his gun was loaded, to which Hanger replied, "Mine is too," and so McVeigh was arrested for the concealed weapon. When being booked, McVeigh used his real name and falsely claimed that he lived at James Nichols' house in Michigan, the brother of Terry Nichols. Upon McVeigh's arrest, Hanger searched the car, and inside he found a business card for a Wisconsin military surplus store, which had writing on the back, reading TNT at $5 a stick, need more. Hanger didn't make any connection to the bombing in Oklahoma just 90 minutes earlier. I assume he would have heard about it on his radio, but we don't know for sure. But either way, he didn't make any connection between that and the man he just arrested, but booked him nonetheless. By the 21st of April, just 2 days after the bombing, the FBI had the name Tim McVeigh. They ran a record search on the National Crime Information Center to see if anyone by this name had been arrested recently, and they struck gold. A man by that name had been arrested on the morning of the bombing in Noble County. That was either a massive coincidence or their man had fucked up. By this time, McVeigh had literally just had a court hearing on the gun charge, but the FBI managed to get in contact just in time, telling Noble County not to release this man. They swiftly turned up and took him into their own custody for questioning. When agents arrived to McVeigh, they asked, "Do you know what we're here for?" To which McVeigh replied, "Probably that Oklahoma City thing." He gave them his name, rank and serial number, and then refused to answer any more questions, instead just asking for an attorney. So, Oklahoma attorney Stephen Jones was appointed as McVeigh's public defender, and he immediately rejects any possibility of an insanity defense, because that was the thing about McVeigh. You'd kind of expect him to be manic, mumbling, irrational, but he wasn't. He was perfectly sane, perfectly in control of himself, something which shocked every single official who spoke to him. McVeigh knew what he was doing, and he did it anyway. He was interviewed by multiple psychiatrists and was found to be 100% sane by them as well as affable and actually likeable. On the 10th of August 1995, a federal grand jury charged McVeigh with 11 criminal counts, including 1 count each of conspiracy to use a weapon of mass destruction, using a weapon of mass destruction, and destruction of a federal building, as well as 8 counts of murder, which is the number of law enforcement officials killed in the blast. Of course, many more people died than just those 8, but this was a federal trial. The US Department of Justice could only bring federal charges against McVeigh for causing the deaths of 8 federal officers, but they could not bring charges against him for the remaining 160 deaths. Those fell under the jurisdiction of the state of Oklahoma. Oklahoma City District Attorney Bob Macy said that he would file state charges in the other 160 murders after McVeigh's co-defendant Terry Nichols was tried later that year, but it never actually came to that, and you'll find out why. McVeigh never denied that he was the one to set the bomb that day. I mean, why would he? He was proud of what he'd done. He was standing up for himself and all American citizens. But he instructed his lawyers to use the necessity defense at his eventual trial. And the necessity defense in criminal law is where the defendant argues that it was necessary for them to commit a crime, usually to prevent some sort of greater harm. An example I found used across the internet to describe this is a drunk driver who might say that they drove their car out of necessity to get away from greater danger, like being kidnapped or they're about to be attacked. But it does very much rely on common sense. For example, if the defendant in the drunk driving example only drove far enough away to get to safety, that's great. If they've driven further away than they needed to, that's where the defence gets a little bit shady. McVeigh wanted to use the necessity defence as a justifiable reason as to why he'd committed his crime, and then he'd be able to present evidence of the crimes of the federal government on what he knew was going to be this huge national stage. He genuinely thought that if he showed the jury the government's actions at Waco and Ruby Ridge, they would agree with him that the bombing was justified. And this trial really was going to be his stage, he thought. It's why, as we theorised earlier, they may have laid a trail of breadcrumbs to get captured. He really thought this was going to be where he showed the entirety of America why he did what he did, what the government is doing to hurt them. And I must stress just how sort of extreme McVeigh's thoughts about this were. I mean, thinking about this from a personal point of view, do I support the British government? I'm British, if you can't tell from my accent, English specifically. Do I think the British government have the best interests of their people at heart right now? No, I personally do not think that. They don't have my best interests at heart. They don't have a lot of people's best interests at heart. I don't like the British government, the Tory government, as it stands right now. Does that, as it stands alone, make me a far-right extremist? No, you're allowed to have issues with your government. That is what democracy is. You're allowed to criticise your government. That is what free speech is. McVeigh's views went so far over that. McVeigh's lawyer, Stephen Jones, was a man who'd taken on many politically charged cases in the past. I must admit, being a defence lawyer, especially in cases like this, is not a role that I covered, but Jones wasn't deterred. He liked a challenge. However, McVeigh and Jones quickly started to butt heads as Jones refused to pursue this necessity defence, as he knew that it just wasn't going to stand up in court for even a second. There is no way that Jones could stand up there and argue that the federal government had put McVeigh or the standard American in any sort of immediate danger. So instead, Jones took a two-pronged approach. One, he was going to try and poke as many holes as he could in the prosecution's case and thus raise question of reasonable doubt, and two, argue that McVeigh was just one cog in a much larger machine, and we're talking larger than just him, Nichols and Fortier. He actually found it very hard to believe that McVeigh had acted alone, and he believed that he was taking on far more responsibility than was actually due to him. McVeigh was clearly guilty, he admitted as much, but how much deeper did it go? Jones spent a lot of time investigating possible ties to these other greater organisations, and that also rubbed McVeigh up the wrong way. He referred to him as Sherlock Jones. He argued that he was supposed to be defending him, not investigating him. And these ties to these greater organisations are going to be explored deeper a bit later in the video. I'm not just rushing past that, we are going to circle back round. Of course, we know that McVeigh wasn't the only person involved in this plot, nor was he the only person arrested. The FBI very quickly caught on to Nichols and Fortier's involvement as well, and they went on the hunt. The capture of Terry Nichols was very easy. Once he heard that the FBI were hunting him down, he just turned himself in. In his home, they found a lot of incriminating evidence. They found ammonium nitrate, books on bomb making, a hand-drawn map of Oklahoma City, on which the Murrah building and the parking spot were very clearly marked. He was interrogated for 9 hours and was then held in federal custody until his trial. Michael Fortier's involvement was a little bit more tricky because, as we know, he'd pulled out of the plan very early on or just never really wanted much to do with it. But both him and his wife Laurie were considered accomplices for their knowledge of the planning of the bombing. McVeigh had shown them his plans. Michael had helped him scout out the federal building. Laurie had even helped him laminate his fake driver's license that was later used to rent the truck. They knew what was going to happen, and yet they never warned anyone. Does that make them just as culpable? You decide. In exchange for testifying against both McVeigh and Nichols, Fortier would be given a reduced sentence and immunity for his wife. I feel like investigators did have to take a bit of a hit on this one, but Fortier was an invaluable witness to have in incriminating both McVeigh and Nichols. They needed his testimony and he was only going to give it in exchange for leniency, so they kind of had to let him go. We'll talk about his trial first, seeing as we're on the topic. So on March 27th, 1998, Fortier was sentenced to 12 years in prison and was fined $75,000 for failing to warn the authorities about the attack. In January 2006, he was released from prison and was promptly transferred into the Witness Protection Program, where he was given an entire new identity. Again, I'll let you share all your opinions about that down below. McVeigh's trial began on the 24th of April 1997, so 2 years after the bombing. By this point, the investigation into the bombing had been one of the most exhaustive in FBI history. No stone was left unturned. The Bureau conducted more than 28,000 interviews, they followed 43,000 different leads, they amassed 3.5 tons of evidence and reviewed nearly 1 billion pieces of information. Can you even imagine that many documents? In the opening statement for the defence, Stephen Jones said that the government had conducted a very hasty 2-week investigation into the actual crime and then just spent the next 2 years focusing solely on his client. I don't know if the stats I mentioned just a moment ago agree with that opening statement from Jones. Regardless, he said that critical evidence was ignored and he mentioned John Doe number 2, the man who was potentially seen with McVeigh as he rented the Ryder truck. Apparently, an eyewitness said that the person that she saw emerge from the truck outside the Murrah building was a black-haired and stocky man with an olive complexion, and that was not McVeigh at all, but it could have matched the description of John Doe number 2. However, the prosecution presented 137 witnesses, including people who were there that day affected by the bombings, telling their stories. They spoke to FBI agents who now shared step by step how they ended up with McVeigh's name. Michael and Laurie Fortier were invaluable as witnesses, filling in some of the holes left by the others. Michael Fortier shared details of how McVeigh acted after Waco, how that really seemed to unleash this real anti-government venom in him. How in October 1994 he shared detailed plans to blow up a building on the 2nd anniversary of Waco. When asked if Fortier ever discussed with McVeigh about the deaths this was going to cause, he said that McVeigh justified it with comparisons to Star Wars. Apparently he really loved Star Wars. McVeigh considered all of the people as if they were stormtroopers. They may have been individually innocent, but because they are part of the evil empire, they were guilty by association. The defence team for McVeigh tried their best, but there really wasn't ever going to be anything they could do. They couldn't come up with an alibi for McVeigh. McVeigh wasn't actually denying anything, and the rental agreements undeniably linked him to the bombing. At the end of May, the jury retreated for their deliberations, which took 23.5 hours over 4 days. On the morning of Monday, the 2nd of June, it was announced they'd finally reached a verdict. McVeigh was found guilty on all 11 counts. He sat expressionless as this was read out. The trial then went into the penalty phase, where the same jury listened to the evidence to decide the punishment that he would be receiving. It was more testimony from victims and rescue workers, parents of the children who had died, his army buddies, and then for 2 days the jury discussed his fate. On Friday, the 13th of June 1997, they announced their decision. It was recommended that McVeigh received the death penalty. Because he was sentenced to death, there was no point of the state of Oklahoma filing murder charges for the remaining 160 victims. On June 11th, 2001, he was put to death by lethal injection. It was the first federal execution in 38 years. McVeigh never flinched, never expressed remorse or regret right up until his death. He thought he had done the right thing. He stood strong in his views. Considering how long some people sit on death row, the fact that he was only on death row for 4 years, 3 years, it wasn't really that long to stew about what he did and what was coming for him. Terry Nichols, of course, also faced trial for his part in all of this. His federal trial took place later in 1997, once again with Fortier providing solid evidence against him. His trial lasted 9 weeks with 100 witnesses tying him to both McVeigh and then the bombing plot. He undeniably helped him purchase and steal bomb ingredients. He parked the getaway car near the Murrah building and he helped assemble the bomb. At the end of the trial, the jury deliberated for 41 hours over a period of 6 days, and he was acquitted of actually detonating the bomb, but he was convicted of conspiring with McVeigh to use a weapon of mass destruction, which is very much still a capital offence. Nichols was also acquitted on charges of first-degree murder, but he was convicted on the lesser charge of involuntary manslaughter. Again, this is for the deaths of the federal officers. In terms of why he was acquitted for the first-degree murder charge, there was actually no evidence that he'd rented the Ryder truck which was used to transport the bomb, nor was there anyone who could positively identify him as the purchaser of 2 tons of ammonium nitrate. He was also undeniably at home in Kansas when the bomb was detonated. And this caused some serious issues because whilst he was definitely involved in the making of the bomb, in the plans, he wasn't actually there. He was also apparently very visually remorseful. He cried several times during testimony, which may have softened the jury. The jury then deliberated for 13 hours over 2 days as to whether or not he should also get the death sentence, but they deadlocked. The district court judge then had no option but to give him a life sentence of imprisonment. So on June 4th, 1998, he was sentenced to life in prison without parole on the conspiracy conviction, and he was called an enemy of the Constitution. He also received a concurrent 48-year sentence for the manslaughter conviction, so 6 years for each victim. And then the state of Oklahoma decided to pursue their charges against him as well. In January 2000, he faced the state trial on 160 capital counts of first-degree murder and 1 count each of fetal homicide, first-degree arson and conspiracy, and they wanted the death penalty for these. It was a 2-month-long trial, including 151 witnesses, with the star witness once again being Fortier. On May 26, 2000, the jury took 5 hours to reach guilty verdicts on all charges. Once again, when it came to deciding a punishment though, it took them just 19.5 hours to deadlock once again on the death penalty. Automatically, it became no longer an option, and instead he was sentenced to 161 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, and he was returned to federal prison. He is never getting out. Before his conviction, he spoke publicly for the first time and basically just preached at the judge. He had now converted to Christianity, it seems, which was a blow to the family members who had lost loved ones in the blast, with Nichols now believing that he could just ask for forgiveness from God and he would get it. They would never be able to hug their loved ones again, their husbands, brothers, sisters, children, wives, ever again. And here is Nichols just preaching at the judge, talking about religion, where for so many of them, they'd lost their faith forever. With McVeigh, Nichols and Fortier receiving their punishments, it is widely thought that everyone responsible for the Oklahoma City bombing was captured and punished accordingly. But there are many people who believe there had to be more to this story. Was Tim McVeigh really able to pull off something like this, the worst act of domestic terrorism in American history to this point, alone, or at least alone for the most part? Many people think not, with whispers of a larger organisation behind him. One of the main talking points as per this is the mystery of John Doe 2, the man who was thought to be with McVeigh as he rented the Ryder truck, potentially backed up by the eyewitness who saw somebody not matching McVeigh's description walking from the truck, somebody who did match the description of John Doe 2. The employees at the rental shop described John Doe 2 as a beefy guy with a square jaw, dark hair, and a tattoo on his arm. He was also wearing a baseball cap with a zigzag design. And this really is something agents followed through on in the early days. The release of these sketches brought in numerous tips, leading to at least a dozen men being arrested. But none of them ended up being the man in question, and neither was he Nichols or Fortier. In the end, the FBI said that John Doe 2 was actually a man called Todd Bunting, who had nothing to do with McVeigh or the bombing. He was an army private who was stationed at nearby Fort Riley. He'd gone to the store about 24 hours after McVeigh had. The authorities said that the employee who described these men had done something called unconscious transference, basically merging these two events together. Bunting did indeed have a tattoo on his arm, and he had been wearing a baseball hat with a zigzag design when he visited. Is it possible that McVeigh did actually have someone with him that day, but in not remembering specific details of the actual man with him, the employee incorrectly remembered details of Bunting, who did have very distinctive features? Was it just a complete misremembering? There's no way of knowing, but the FBI do seem to think it was the latter. The employee just got it entirely wrong. McVeigh was on his own. So it seems that John Doe number 2 was irrelevant to this case, at least as far as the official investigation. And this is kind of where this video ties in with the sponsor today, Audible's The Debutante. Again, if you want a real deep dive into that aspect of the story, then I highly recommend you go and listen to the story of Carol Howe. But Carol Howe was a member of something called Elohim City, and she actually ended up testifying at McVeigh's trial. Elohim City was, or as I should say, is a private community located in Adair County in Oklahoma, just on the border of the state with, I think, Arkansas. It's a 400-acre rural retreat founded in 1973 by a man called Robert Miller, who was a leader of the Christian identity movement, which is an interpretation of Christianity that is incredibly popular in extreme right-wing circles. Christian identity is basically a hugely racist religious ideology that argues that white Anglo-Saxon Americans are the true children of Israel, whilst all non-whites are mud people. Jewish people are considered to be subhuman, whilst black people are not considered human at all. Christian identity is a small ideology, but a virulent one. It influences basically all white supremacist and anti-government movements, and they have been known to be linked with well-known incidents of domestic terrorism, particularly in the second half of the 20th century. It's known that in the 1990s, a number of far-right extremists spent time at Elohim City. It was considered to be the centre of the Christian identity movement. There were a number of different anti-government groups there, building compounds and arming themselves, preparing themselves for the very obviously incoming war against the government. You can very much see the link with McVeigh and his general ideologies here, can't you? And over the years, many people have made links between McVeigh and Elohim City. Writer John Solomon's investigation led him to believe that Elohim City actually played a major role in the bombing. FBI investigation showed that on April 16th, so just 3 days before the bombing, 2 Elohim City members left the compound for a location in Kansas City, very close to where McVeigh was doing his final assembly of the bomb with Nichols. 2 other members told federal agents that they could provide information linking McVeigh to the Aryan resistance. In 1997, informant John Schultz told agents that he was sure without a shadow of a doubt that he had seen McVeigh at Elohim City in 1994 at a meeting about a mysterious delivery and the use of a rider truck. Now, McVeigh insists that he never went there, but Schultz isn't the only person to have claimed that he saw him there. He even at one point received a ticket from an Arkansas highway patrolman on a road that led directly to Elohim City. And there wasn't much else that this road led to. According to FBI reports, it's even probable that McVeigh even participated in a number of bank robberies around the Midwest with a gang from Elohim City to raise money for projects involving anti-government violence. It's thought that he cased the banks and drove the getaway car in a number of these heists. In September 1994, we already know that McVeigh had started plotting the bombing. It's thought that that was specifically on the 13th of September. On that day, McVeigh was, according to FBI reports, staying in a motel room in Vian, Oklahoma, and more than likely visiting Elohim City. It was also that day that a new federal law came into place banning assault weapons. According to Carol Howe, an undercover informant in Elohim City, the leaders there made 3 trips to Oklahoma City to inspect possible bombing targets. The alarm about this was raised by Carol and they planned a raid on the compound, but it never ended up happening. Had they done so, could they have stopped McVeigh's bombing? Was Elohim City involved? Despite all I've just shared, it is widely thought that any solid connection between McVeigh and Elohim City is just speculation. There's nothing solid, apparently, to suggest they had anything to do with the bombings. As I said, McVeigh denies ever visiting there. If they were involved though, would McVeigh have spilled? It's very unlikely. He did already spin a series of lies to shield both Nichols and Fortier. He denied their involvement entirely at first. So who's to say that he wouldn't lie to protect others? Or not even lie, just not mention the involvement of others. The FBI seemed very sure that it was him and he acted alone. What if there was more? And of course, Elohim City isn't the only conspiracy theory here. In the days immediately following the blast, many people suspected the involvement of foreign terrorists, particularly terrorists from the Middle East, following the bombing at the World Trade Center not too long before this. I think it was only a couple of years before. When it was found that the bomber was actually a homegrown white American male, some people just couldn't wrap their heads around it. There had to be foreign involvement here. Some believe that instead of working with a white supremacist group, perhaps McVeigh was working closely with foreign terrorist groups instead, maybe Al-Qaeda. All in all, there's never been too much, if any, evidence to back this up. Some sources say that Nichols went on a foreign trip and when he came home he was very knowledgeable about all things bomb making, but that might be the strongest link we have here, and that's not even that strong. Others theorise that the United States government knew all about the bombing and had actually approved it beforehand. Some real mental gymnastics is required here for this one, so see if you can keep up with me. Basically, some people think that McVeigh was actually working with the government to frame the militia movement or enact anti-terrorism legislation. Essentially, that he was used as a scapegoat for a greater good by the government. In a 1993 letter to his sister, McVeigh claims that whilst at Fort Bragg, he was recruited into a secret black ops team that smuggled drugs into the US to fund covert activities, to quiet anyone who was deemed a security risk. In 2001, Nichols, who was obviously McVeigh's higher up in the army, backed this up. Apparently, McVeigh was ordered to make contact with anti-government individuals and far-right sympathisers as part of this government plan. This all escalated to the armed robberies and ultimately to the bombing, all, again, part of the government plan. All in all, I don't think my brain can quite stretch far enough to do the mental gymnastics required for this one. There's really nothing to back this theory up by the writings of McVeigh, who was very clearly slowly falling down the rabbit hole, and Nichols, whose best interest it is to try and deflect blame away from himself and from McVeigh. I just struggle to believe that this theory has any basis in reality at all. At least the links there really aren't that strong when you compare it to, say, the Elohim City link. Was McVeigh part of a larger network? It wouldn't surprise me, but we don't know anything for sure. As we know, he is now dead. Maybe the authorities know more, but they'll probably never tell. But we do know that regardless, no matter which way you look at it, McVeigh was the one directly responsible for this bombing, for 168 deaths. Just over a month after the bombing, what was left of the Murrah building was demolished, and now there stands a beautiful memorial for the victims with a reflection pool and beautiful sculptures. Once an area of destruction and violence, it's now an area of peace. Surviving victims have said that they never want this event to be forgotten about. They want it spoken about. They want it to be a learning moment for all Americans. This is what happens when people are left unchecked, when people go too far off the deep end. Maybe for many, extreme politics, extreme beliefs can be unharmful, maybe at least for the most part. Most people, 99% of people, are never going to do something this extreme, no matter what their political views are. But for some, that 1%, it becomes the only logical step, and that is beyond dangerous. Seeing the far-right politics being demonstrated across the USA right now, as a foreign person looking in, researching this scared me. I see similarities between McVeigh's thoughts and some of the stuff I see being spouted on Twitter on a daily basis. I'm not going to insert my own thoughts and feelings here too much lest I get attacked, but I'll let this video speak for itself. Across the country, the bombing shattered people's idea of safety. The USA overnight became a more cautious society, and this is what led to the seeds of Homeland Security being planted, although it didn't come into full action until 2003 on the back of the 9/11 attacks. Homeland Security is responsible for public security, with one of the main missions being anti-terrorism of both the foreign and homegrown kind. Timothy McVeigh was a white man, American born and bred, and he was a terrorist, as are so many others, even though the media balks at labelling them with that name. McVeigh believed he was going to cause people to rebel against the government, but what actually happened was the opposite. American people stood in solidarity against people like him. I don't really know how to round up this video. How do you round up a video like this with so much pain and destruction and hurt caused by one man, caused by extremist views? I suppose all you can do is keep the stories of the victims alive, keep the story of the event alive, and just hope that it never happens again, that people spot the warning signs. Thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you for spending this time with me and with the story and with the victims here. Thank you to Audible for sponsoring this video, and I will see you in the next one. Bye guys.